Money never touches your brain directly. It doesn't have to. It just needs your bloodstream. This isn't a documentary about investing, saving, or building wealth. It's about what money is quietly doing to your body and mind, right now, whether you have a lot of it or very little, because the nervous system doesn't actually care about your bank balance. It only cares about threat. And to a brain built over millions of years to survive scarcity, a red number in a banking app can feel exactly like a predator in the grass, even though nothing about a banking app can actually kill you. The body doesn't know the difference. It was never designed to. What follows isn't opinion, and it isn't self-help. It's neuroscience, endocrinology, and psychology, most of it published in the last 15 years, almost none of it widely known outside the labs that produced it. 8 separate effects, each one documented on its own. By the end, you'll see they were never separate at all. In 2008, researchers from Cambridge Judge Business School walked onto a real trading floor in London and drew saliva samples from actual traders, twice a day, for 8 straight working days. What they found reshaped how economists think about risk itself. On volatile mornings, cortisol levels in the traders' saliva rose by as much as 68% above baseline, measurable proof that a market crash isn't just a spreadsheet event. It's a physical one, happening inside the very people meant to stay rational through it. The researchers then went further, recreating that chemical state directly in the lab, raising cortisol in a separate group of volunteers over 8 days using carefully controlled doses. No market, no losses, just the hormone itself. The result, those volunteers became measurably more risk-averse, and more likely to misjudge small probabilities, than they'd been the week before. Nothing about their intelligence had changed. Their hormones had simply rewritten their relationship to risk without asking permission, and without them noticing it had happened at all. Cortisol is not the villain here. It's the body's oldest alarm system, and for most of human history it worked exactly as intended, a burst of stress hormone to help you outrun a threat, followed by a return to calm once the threat had actually passed. The problem is that a mortgage doesn't pass. A revolving credit card balance doesn't resolve itself by Friday, no matter how many times the alarm goes off about it. So the alarm built for a 10-second sprint stays lit for years, sometimes decades, and that single, chronically open alarm is the root every other effect in this documentary grows out of. Start with the most obvious branch. The alarm doesn't always wait for an actual emergency. Sometimes it just runs continuously, in the background, as a low hum most people have stopped noticing. According to the American Psychological Association's most recent Stress in America survey, roughly 2 out of 3 adults say money is a significant source of stress, consistently ranked ahead of work, health, and even relationships, year after year the survey has run. Among adults under 35, that number climbs past 80%. This isn't garden variety worry. It's the amygdala, the almond-sized threat detector sitting deep in the brain, treating a checking account the same way it would treat a physical predator, because the amygdala doesn't process abstractions like compound interest or minimum payment. It only recognizes one thing: is this safe, or is this not? A bank balance below a certain threshold reads as a not, and the alarm fires exactly as it would for a genuine physical danger, adrenaline and all, dozens of times a week, for people who will never actually be harmed by the number itself. That's anxiety, chemically defined, an alarm system that can't tell the difference between a lion and a late fee, firing at full volume for both. Picture the version of this that happens at 2 in the afternoon, at a desk, for no visible reason at all. A phone buzzes with an unknown number. Heart rate up, palms damp, a half-second of genuine dread, before the caller ID resolves into a wrong number, or a robocal, or nothing at all. The body had already mobilized for a threat that turned out not to exist, and it will do the same thing again tomorrow, and the day after, because the amygdala doesn't learn from false alarms the way the rest of the brain does. It just keeps answering the same question the same way, every single time it's asked. An alarm that never fully switches off doesn't just make you anxious. It actively steals processing power from the rest of your brain, and the clearest proof of that comes from a Harvard and Princeton study that had nothing to do with Wall Street at all. The same research team first tested this in a New Jersey shopping mall, asking people to imagine how they'd cover a projected expense, sometimes cheap, sometimes costly, before taking a short cognitive test. Lower-income shoppers did fine when the imagined cost was small, but their scores dropped sharply when it was large, as if the mere thought of a big bill was enough to borrow processing power from the rest of the test. Higher-income shoppers showed no such drop either way. The expense was hypothetical. The cognitive damage was not. To see if the effect held up outside a lab, the researchers traveled to Tamil Nadu, India, and studied real sugarcane farmers, who are paid once a year, at harvest. The months before harvest are financially tight. The months after are comfortable. The same 464 farmers took identical cognitive tests in both periods, and scored dramatically worse before the harvest than after, on tasks measuring attention and reasoning that had nothing to do with money at all. The effect was equivalent to a 13-point drop in IQ, or the cognitive impairment of losing an entire night's sleep. Same farmers. Same intelligence. The only thing that changed was how much money was currently in the house. The researchers called it a bandwidth tax. Financial worry doesn't just occupy your thoughts. It rents out cognitive real estate that used to belong to everything else: parenting, work, patience, memory, and it charges that rent whether you consciously notice the withdrawal or not. Picture the version of this that happens at a kitchen table, not a lab. Someone sits down to help their kid with math homework, and can't hold the numbers still in their head, not because the math is hard, but because a different number, from a bill sitting 3 feet away on a counter, keeps pulling focus back to itself. The kid just sees a distracted parent. The parent just feels foggy, or tired, or somehow worse at this than they used to be. Neither of them can see the bandwidth tax being collected in real time, decision by decision, all day, every day. Stay in that state long enough, and the bandwidth tax stops being occasional. It becomes the weather you live in, and one of the largest reviews ever conducted on the subject shows exactly where that weather tends to end up. In 2013, a systematic review out of the University of Southampton pooled 65 separate studies and found that people carrying unsecured debt were more than 3 times as likely to have a diagnosable mental disorder, and nearly 3 times as likely to be depressed, compared to people without debt. The relationship held even after researchers controlled for income itself, meaning it wasn't poverty alone driving the effect. It was the debt, specifically, sitting on top of it, that made the difference. Depression doesn't announce itself as a financial condition. Almost nobody watching this would think to blame a credit card statement for a mood that's been low for months, or a sense of dread that shows up every time the phone rings with an unknown number. But the data keeps finding the same thread running underneath: review after review, population after population, country after country. Sometimes it isn't the current balance doing the damage. Sometimes it's a number from years ago that never actually left the building. The same review found something else worth pausing on: the relationship ran in both directions. Debt predicted worse mental health, and worse mental health, in turn, predicted more debt, impulsive spending as a coping mechanism, avoidance of unopened mail, decisions made from inside the exact bandwidth tax already described. Not a single event. A feedback loop, quietly tightening on itself, with each side making the other one worse. Financial psychologists have a name for a related pattern: financial trauma, a lasting physiological imprint left by a distressing money experience, encoded deeply enough that the nervous system keeps sounding the alarm long after the danger has actually passed. Researcher Brad Klontz, who has spent over 2 decades studying the phenomenon, calls the originating moments financial flashpoints: the eviction notice taped to a door, the parents fighting over a bounce check at the kitchen table, the bankruptcy nobody in the family ever talks about at holidays. The body doesn't file these under history. It files them under still happening, and it can keep responding to a threat from 20 years ago every single time a bill arrives in a mailbox today: the same spike, the same tightness in the chest, the same old alarm, triggered by an envelope that has nothing to do with the one that started it, opened by hands that are, technically, decades safer than they were back then. Klontz's research also found something stranger. People often inherit these flashpoints secondhand, absorbing a parent's financial fear so early in childhood that they carry the anxiety into adulthood without ever experiencing the original event themselves. A child doesn't need to lose a house to learn that houses can be lost. Watching a parent's face change color while reading a piece of mail is sometimes teaching enough. The lesson lands before language does, filed away as a rule about the world rather than a memory of one bad afternoon. The trauma doesn't require your own eviction notice. Watching someone else's is sometimes enough to install the same alarm, permanently, in a completely different life, decades before that child ever opens a bill of their own. That inherited alarm doesn't stay contained to one person, either way. It moves into the next relationship it finds, and it rarely announces itself as the actual subject of the argument. Picture the fight that isn't really about the receipt on the counter. 2 people, raised in 2 different houses with 2 different relationships to scarcity, standing in a kitchen at 11 at night, both convinced the other one just doesn't get it. One grew up watching a parent hide grocery bags in the trunk before carrying them inside. The other grew up never once hearing the word afford spoken out loud. Neither one is arguing about the actual dollar amount. They're arguing in 2 different languages that happen to use the same numbers. In 2012, researchers analyzed longitudinal data from over 4,500 married couples and found that disagreements about money were the single strongest predictor of divorce, stronger than arguments about in-laws, chores, or even how a couple spent their time together. Money arguments weren't just more frequent than other fights. They were measurably longer and more intense, dragging on well past the point where most disagreements would have resolved themselves. The researchers' explanation was simple and unsettling: couples rarely think they're fighting about money. They're fighting about what money represents to each of them: safety, control, worth, love, and those fights cut deeper precisely because neither person is actually arguing about the number on the receipt. By now the pattern should be getting hard to miss. Every domain this reaches, it reaches at night first, in the one stretch of the day that's supposed to belong to no one but you. In 2025, researchers at Rice University tracked full-time Army and Air National Guard service members for 9 months, using both self-reports and wrist-worn sleep trackers to get objective, not just remembered, data. Financial worry reported at the start of the study predicted elevated stress specifically at bedtime months later, lying awake, replaying the day, mentally rehearsing tomorrow's problems before they've even happened, and that bedtime stress predicted measurably worse sleep quality 5 months after that. The effect showed up even among people who looked financially stable on paper the entire time. The worry alone was enough to reach into the one part of the day that was supposed to be free of it, and quietly rewrite it too. There's a cruel mechanical detail buried in that finding. Sleep is one of the only remaining tools the brain has to actually clear cortisol from the system overnight. Financial stress doesn't just disrupt sleep. It disrupts the exact process that was supposed to be undoing the day's damage, sabotaging its own repair mechanism, night after night, on a loop that never gets a chance to reset. Follow that same chain far enough, and it stops being abstract entirely. It shows up on a blood panel. Chronic financial stress is now linked, in peer-reviewed research, to elevated inflammatory markers, impaired immune response, increased visceral fat accumulation, and higher long-term cardiovascular risk, the same category of numbers a doctor checks for on an ordinary physical exam, quietly drifting in the wrong direction, for reasons that will never show up on the chart itself as money. Researchers studying financial strain have also documented something more behavioral. People under sustained money stress are measurably more likely to delay doctor's visits, skip prescriptions, and postpone preventive care, not from ignorance, but because the bandwidth tax and the alarm system are both still running, and a future health problem always feels more postponable than a present-tense bill. It's a vicious arrangement by design. The stress most likely to make you sick is also the stress most likely to convince you a checkup can wait. And that's where all 8 of these threads collapse into the same physical fact. Poor sleep doesn't just make you tired. It elevates the exact stress hormone this documentary started with, which sharpens the exact anxiety response the amygdala produces, which impairs the exact cognitive bandwidth the sugarcane farmers lost, which worsens the exact mood disorders the debt research measured, which reactivates the exact old wounds the Flashpoint research uncovered, which strains the exact relationships the divorce study tracked, which quietly erodes the exact physical health the blood panel measures, which makes the original financial problem measurably harder to actually solve, a closed loop, with no single entry point, because every entry point leads back to the same alarm system, and every exit attempt runs straight through it again. Money was never just a resource being managed. It's a signal being processed by the oldest, least rational part of the brain, the part that doesn't read bank statements, only threat levels, the same way it doesn't read the difference between a predator and a past due notice. Anxiety, decision fatigue, depression, financial trauma, relationship strain, disrupted sleep, and a body quietly wearing down over years, none of it is 8 separate costs of financial stress, arriving one after another like items on a bill. It's one nervous system, sounding one alarm, echoing through 8 different rooms of the same house at once, all night, every night, whether or not anyone in the house is even awake to hear it. If any of this sounds less like a documentary and more like your actual week, that's worth sitting with rather than rushing past it. This is a well-documented, physiological response, not a character flaw, not a discipline problem, not a sign that you're somehow worse at life than everyone around you managing to look calm while carrying the exact same weight. It's the kind of thing a doctor or a therapist can genuinely help with, the same way they'd help with any other alarm system that's gotten stuck in the on position, because that's really all any of this is, underneath the statistics and the studies and the century of research behind them. A stuck alarm. Not a verdict on who you are, and not something you were ever supposed to figure out alone. The traders on that London floor never saw the cortisol rewriting their decisions in real time. They just felt cautious, and assumed the caution was entirely their own idea, a conclusion they reasoned their way to, carefully, rationally, the way a trader is trained to. It wasn't reasoning at all. The hormone had already made the decision before the thought ever arrived to explain it, and dressed itself up as logic on the way out. Nobody outside that trading floor is any different. The parent distracted at the kitchen table, the couple arguing at 11 at night, the person lying awake doing math in the dark. None of them are watching a hormone make their decisions for them either. It never announces itself. It just quietly rewrites the terms and hands you back a conclusion that feels entirely like your own. That's the part worth remembering longer than any statistic in this documentary. The chemical was never asking permission, and it still isn't, in a trading pit or a kitchen or a bedroom at 2 in the morning. It was already deciding for you, quietly, long before you ever felt like you decided anything at all, and the first step out of that loop was never willpower. It was simply learning the alarm's name.